In order to be profoundly dishonest, a person must have one of two qualities. Either he is unscrupulously ambitious, or he is unswervingly egocentric. He must believe that for his ends to be served, all things and people can justifiably be shifted about, or that he is the center not only of his own world, but of the worlds which others inhabit. Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Welcome back to the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm so glad you've joined me for another episode in the Heather Turner case. If you're new to Heather's case, I have a playlist of videos that I've made about it, and I'll leave a link to it in the description box. As a brief recap, Heather was found deceased from a gunshot wound to the head on May 4th, 2017, in the Dallas, Georgia home she shared with her fake husband, Andy Turner. Andy claims he found her that morning and insists it had to be a suicide. The Georgia Bureau of Investigations performed the autopsy and classified her death as undetermined. It has remained there ever since. Many people don't believe Andy's versions of events. In 2023, he wrote a book that supposedly sets the record straight, but Andy's record doesn't coincide with the truth. He also gave interviews on his book tour, one with Connie Smith on the Talk with Connie on WDNN TV, which is a northern Georgia station, and one on the Paulding County News podcast. I'll leave links to the full interviews in the description box. We've already looked at a large chunk of Andy's dismal flop of a book, and in this episode we'll be wading through the remainder of it, starting in 2016 and following the manure trail all the way to the end of the barnyard. If you get the urge to read Andy's book, please don't buy it new. You can find used copies online, or maybe you can borrow it from someone. I could try to help you get a copy if you'd like. Anything to keep him from profiting from it. Then again, maybe if he sold more books, he could actually pay his child support. In Chapter 13, Andy began his attack on Robbie Aber, who is the co-worker of Heather's that she was leaving Andy for. Andy said that he called Rob and he gave him the what for and the howdy do and told him to leave his wife alone. Andy then said that Rob went into the probate office and told Andy's mother, quote, "That son of yours, how can you be around him? He just called and threatened me," end quote. Then Rob began flailing his arms, talking loudly, stomping and telling coworkers a story that was way different than how the phone call actually went down. Now, I don't know if this is Andy's mother Pam's version of events or just something that Andy made up. Whoever wrote it, thank you, because the flailing arms things just brings up an image of Rob as an air puppet, just frantically waving his ridiculously long arms all over the office, and that makes me giggle. Andy continued his story about Rob with, quote, "He created a false sense of endangerment and someone suggested he file a report. I was told at one point that the judge advised that if I showed up, I should not be allowed in the building. I've never been able to confirm this, but I do have the incident report," end quote. Andy then shared an incident report, but it wasn't the full report. It was the supplemental report that was attached to the initial incident report, the one that explained why the supplemental report came about. And here's the full report with the supplemental report. At approximately 08:32, Debbie Hendricks from probate clerk's office called and said Judge Anderson wants you to call her on her cell. At approximately 08:39, I spoke with Judge Anderson, and she stated her employee Heather Turner's husband has gone off the deep end, that he was coming up to the office harassing her. Last night he'd gotten drunk and wrecked the company car, and he's at home sitting on the porch with a gun. Judge wanted to know if we could keep him from coming into the building. I told the judge that Heather needed to get a restraining order, that this is a public building, but we could get him out if he's harassing Heather in their office or causing a disturbance. That security would check him good before letting him in the building. I called Captain Godsey to see if he would go by to do a welfare check. No welfare check was completed because Heather did not want one. Deputy Barker spoke with Robbie Aber because he had received a call from Heather's husband, and he spoke with Heather Turner to give her an option to consider. And here's the supplemental report. On April 12, 2017, around 0930 hours, I spoke to Joel Aber, who works in the probate officer and goes by Robbie. I spoke to him at this courthouse in the probate office. I advised him we in court security had been advised of a phone call he received from Heather Turner's husband. I advised him I came to see if he wanted to file a report about the incident. Robbie stated he did not because he did not want to make her problems any worse. He said if Heather wanted to file a report, then he would write a statement. I then spoke with Heather Turner, who also works in the probate office. She stated she did not wish to make a report at this time because she did not want to make her husband mad. I advised her if she changed her mind to contact us and we would file a report. Deputy Barker. So what's the matter, Andy? How come you didn't want to include the initial report in your book? What company car did he wreck, and was he ever charged with a DUI? Even when Andy shared the supplemental report, he left out part of it. Now here's what was in the original. Robbie stated he did not want to make her problems any worse. He said if Heather wanted to file a report, then he would write a statement. But when Andy wrote about it, it became Robbie stated he did not because Heather wanted to file a report and he would write a statement. So he left out the part about Rob not wanting to make Heather's problems any worse. So weird he'd leave that part out, isn't it? And then Andy couldn't even get the deputy's name right. In his book, he has the name as Deputy Baker, but his name is Deputy Barker. Andy included all of that as a way to belittle Rob, but once you know the facts and look at how Andy presented his version of events, it just makes him out to be pathetically trite and more than a little jealous of Rob. Whenever Andy speaks or writes about the night before Heather's death, it's as though he's following a script, and he has it down pat. His version is that the day before her death, Heather called or emailed him and told him she was going to make his favorite meal. Salmon patties with biscuits and gravy and cantaloupe. Only Andy pronounces it salmon, because of course he does. He said that their daughter had been riding her bike that afternoon because it was such a beautiful day outside. Then she wanted Andy to throw the football with her. When Heather got home from work, she jumped out of her car, ran and tackled Andy in the yard, even though she was wearing dress clothes and heels, and they rolled around laughing until their daughter had to join them and jumped on the pile. And then the Hallmark Channel showed up with cameras rolling. That last bit might be something I just made up. Their daughter went back to riding her bike, and Andy and Heather sat on the porch. That's when she allegedly told Andy she was either going to be fired or forced to quit her job. And the reason was because of the emails she'd sent to Andy, along with other personal emails being sent on company time. According to Andy, Heather wasn't upset at all about her job ending, and she was looking forward to being home more with their daughter. Then the daughter wrote a narrative, and I'm not going to get into most of what she wrote, but she starts with, "It was a nice sunny afternoon." Now, I've often thought that Andy fed his daughter information about that day, and her saying that it was a sunny afternoon shows that. Andy described it as a beautiful day, but I looked up the weather on that day and it was cloudy. So either they are both misremembering what kind of day it was, or Andy manipulated her into thinking she remembered the day when really he was feeding her the information. Heather and her daughter made dinner, and after dinner, when Andy tried to clean up, Heather stopped him and proceeded to jump on his back and yelled, "Giddy up." Quote, "I dropped the dishes into the sink and began to prance around the island with her. 'Faster, my valiant steed,' she yelled. We made several laps like I was a rodeo stallion, then ran out into the dining room and into the living room, gaining speed. We then made a barrel turn, heading back for the kitchen. All along I was being spurred and whipped and told to giddy up." End quote. Oh my dear goodness. I'm embarrassed just repeating all of this. And Andy said that their daughter was taking photos of all this happening. When I first read this account, I wondered if there was violence happening between Andy and Heather, and this story was just a way of explaining it to his daughter. Mommy and Daddy were just playing. According to Andy, the night went on with the daughter working at her pottery wheel. They all watched a movie, and then the daughter fell asleep on the sofa. Now, according to an extremely reliable source, Andy had said that his daughter was sick that evening, so he'd given her Benadryl to help her sleep. Then Andy said that Heather initiated sex with him. I knew that halfwit was talking about sex when he mentioned husband and wife time in the police report. I don't think sex was really in the cards that night. So Andy repeats the same script over and over, and he tells it like it's the best story he's ever written. But it's not accurate. Heather didn't fix the dinner that night before she died. It was 2 nights before. The night before she died, they ate leftovers. Andy made a Facebook post on May 9th, 2017, 5 days after Heather's death. Quote, "In fact, our last 2 days together were amazing. She prepared my favorite dinner, homemade biscuits, gravy, salmon patties, corn, and peas. We sat at the table for 4 hours talking about our love, travels, children, and memories. We laughed so much. The next day, she came in and sat with me on the porch. I rubbed her feet and she relaxed. We ate leftovers and she changed her routine. Normally at 9:30 to 10, she goes to bed as she gets up early. However, this night was different. We stayed up till 4 a.m. having beautiful husband and wife time." End quote. So, no mention of his daughter riding her bike or throwing a football. No mention of Heather tackling him in the front yard. No mention of him giving her a piggyback ride around the house. He even has proof in his book that Heather hadn't cooked for him the night before her death. In this text exchange he shared between him and Heather, notice that the talk about everything being in the kitchen comes before the text that was sent at 7:30 in the morning on May 3rd, 2017. I mean, this guy is such an idiot that he included a screenshot in his book that was supposed to prove the lie he was telling in it, but it does the opposite. So why did Andy change the story? Why did it matter if the meal was 2 nights before or the night before? I think it's because he's been pushing the narrative that Heather had gone out of her way to make things special for him, that she had planned her death and wanted to make her final night on Earth all about Andy. Ugh. This is what he wrote in the book about it. Quote, "She planned our meal and this night in advance. It is not a coincidence that she lined up all of these as she did and when she did. I have no doubt that it was thought out on her part to let me know she cared, but felt trapped in the situation she created. She had made mistakes, but she wanted to show she loved me." End quote. But she hadn't done all of that. There was no lining up, no planning, nothing special. She had given him leftovers. And again, this shows that their daughter doesn't have actual memories of the night before because she can't remember something that didn't happen. She remembers what she was told, the script that Andy had written. Andy and his daughter also give the same exact account of what happened the following morning. They heard a loud noise and then both ran to the bathroom and saw Heather. But let's remember that on the day of Heather's death, Andy told both the 911 dispatcher and Deputy Shannon Bradbury that his daughter had been asleep on the sofa when he found Heather. He only changed his story later. So Andy said a loud noise woke him up and he ran to the bathroom door and opened it. I would think a more natural thing would have been to call Heather's name first and ask if she was all right. He later said he thought the noise was the shower organizer falling. So if he really thought that, why not call out to Heather to see if that's what it was before barging in the bathroom? Andy said he picked up his daughter and pulled her out of the doorway so she couldn't see Heather, and he carried her back to the sofa and told her not to move. Now, it seems like an odd place to put her, because according to one of her narratives in the book, the sofa was directly across from Heather and Andy's bedroom door. In the daughter's narrative, she said, quote, "He called my grandmother to come sit with me because he was afraid I would get up and see all of what happened. His voice was breaking and he had tears streaming down his face." End quote. According to Andy, he called his mother and said, "Mom, I need you to come here now. Heather has shot herself." So here's the problem with those narratives. Andy later said that his daughter didn't know that Heather had died until she overheard him and his uncle talking about it later that day. And she supposedly didn't know it was by a gunshot wound until days later when it aired on the news. Now, let me clarify that I don't think the daughter is lying. I think she's repeating what Andy convinced her she saw. So if she watched her dad call her grandmother, and in that call Andy told his mother that Heather had shot herself, The daughter would have known right after it happened. Andy really didn't think some of this through, and either he didn't have a proofreader or editor, or they were both exceedingly bad at their jobs. So, how did Andy know that Heather had shot herself? Why wasn't he worried that there was an intruder in the house? According to him, as soon as he opened the door, he saw Heather and immediately picked up his daughter and took her to the living room. How did he know there wasn't someone hiding in the bathroom? He later said that when he was on the phone with 911, the dispatcher asked him where the gun was. Quote, I remember the lady on the phone asking me where the gun was. I looked around and recognized it. It was the .38 that I had gotten for her. End quote. So he hadn't seen the gun when he first walked into the bathroom? He has said multiple times that Heather was always happy and had never talked about ending her own life. And according to him, the night before she died was just great and everybody was happier than a pig in poop. So why would his immediate thought be that she had ended her own life? Andy said that when his mother and father got there, they went into the bathroom where he was, and his dad told him to stop doing CPR, so Andy stopped. He then was holding Heather when he said that deputies showed up and told him he had to leave the bathroom. As soon as he walked out of the bathroom, deputies had formed a semicircle and told him to stick out his hands. Quote, I'm surrounded, 2 men on each arm. They hold my arms out as a lady starts touching my hands all over with what looks like an ink blotter. End quote. That's how Andy described getting a gunshot residue test. Now, I'm not sure any of that actually happened, and I'm not sure Andy knows what an ink blotter is. Let's look at Deputy Shannon Bradbury's report, and he was the first officer on the scene. Quote, when I looked in the bathroom, I noticed an unidentified white male holding an unidentified white female on the floor in his arms. The male was later identified as Andy Turner, and the female was identified as Heather Turner. I noticed what appeared to be a gunshot on the left side of Heather Turner's cheek, right in front of her ear. I then asked Andy Turner where the gun was located, and he stated in the towel beside the toilet. I noticed the barrel and revolver of a pistol sticking out of a bloody towel lying on the floor beside the toilet. Metro arrived, and Andy Turner was told he had to leave the room, and he got up and went with Curtis Turner. End quote. And at the time Shannon wrote this report, I was under the impression that other than Corporal Lewis, there was no other law enforcement there at the time. And in fact, Shannon later wrote, when detectives Lieutenant Christopher and Dykes arrived, the scene was turned over to them. The only other interaction that Deputy Bradbury had with Andy was when Andy gave a statement to him. So Andy wasn't immediately surrounded, according to Deputy Bradbury. He left with his father. So who should we believe, kids? The guy who's been caught in multiple lies, or the deputy who has no reason to lie on his report? Andy claimed that after the deputies performed the gunshot residue test, they made him strip so they could take photos of him. Then Andy was allowed to go to the kitchen to wash the blood off of his hands. I'm assuming and hoping for everyone's sake that was there that day that he put clothes on first. When he got to the kitchen, he said he noticed that the coffee pot was on and his coffee mug was under the spout, not Heather's. He said it was out of the norm, that Heather had always made hers and took it with her, and then he would get up and make his own coffee. He was confused as to why his cup was under the spout. He said he looked around and at first couldn't find her cup, but then saw it in the trash can, so he took it out and put it in the sink. So is he trying to make us believe that Heather had planned on ending her life, so she threw away her coffee mug the night before? Why would anyone even think to look in the trash can for a mug? I have paced the house with this running through my head, trying to figure out why he would include it in his book. If you have an idea, please let me know in the comments. The coroner and assistant coroner showed up then, and Andy had to make it a point to let everyone know that he knew them. Well, you should. Until Dallas had a growth spurt starting in 2000, there were only around 3,200 people in town. Quote, I know Lindsay from being kids, playing at her father's funeral home, end quote. Dude, you're 13 years older than her. I seriously doubt you were playing together as kids at her father's funeral home. Crime Online had an interview with Lindsay, and she said she wasn't sure why Andy claimed he grew up with her. Oh, I know why. Because he's a big old stonkin' honkin' liar. Andy knew Lindsay so well he couldn't even spell her name correctly in his book. Or maybe that's his passive aggressive way of letting everyone know that she really doesn't matter to him. At the scene, he asked Lindsay if they'd have to do a full autopsy on Heather because he hated to think about what they did to bodies during an autopsy. I wonder if that's really why he didn't want to have a full autopsy done. I've put in a FOIA request with the Georgia Bureau of Investigations for Heather's autopsy report, but I haven't heard back from them yet. And I also put in a request for all of the police incident reports in Paulding County that involve Andy. The file is too big to be sent by email, so they are sending it to me in the mail. However, I'm pretty sure they're coming on a CD. I didn't know that anyone still used CDs. I guess I should be grateful they aren't sending a floppy disk. Andy goes on to write about how he gave a statement to Lieutenant Christopher and that Christopher was very kind to him. In the version that Andy wrote in his book about the note Heather allegedly left, he overheard an officer say something about a note and he asked to see it. Lieutenant Christopher told Andy they wouldn't allow the note to be moved, so he told him to follow him to the bathroom and he would show him. It was on Heather's sink and had been written on a page of Andy's travel planner. But in the Paulding County News podcast, when asked if Heather had left a note, Andy said she did, but he didn't know where it had been left. He said one of the detectives brought the note to him to read. So he both knew and didn't know where the note was. And isn't that kind of an odd spot for her to have left a note in his travel planner? I wonder if maybe this was a note that she had left at some other time. Maybe they had gotten into a fight and Andy was getting ready to leave on a work trip, so she'd left that note for him to find later. Andy then said that Lieutenant Christopher told him, quote, "Mr. Turner, on behalf of the Sheriff's Department, we offer our condolences. This is an open and shut case of suicide," end quote. He also said that Christopher said that same thing to his parents and in front of his daughter. But later he said that he hadn't told his children it was suicide. I would love to be able to ask Lieutenant Christopher if he actually said that to Andy, but unfortunately he died in 2020. Andy wrote that by the time everyone left that day, he had been questioned for almost 3 hours. But in an interview with Connie Smith on the Talk with Connie, Andy said he'd been questioned for 5 hours. And on the Paulding County News podcast, he said he'd been questioned over 5 hours. Other reports showed that Andy wasn't really questioned much at all. He gave statements that day, but he's never been formally interviewed. And in fact, Andy has repeatedly refused to go to the sheriff's office for an interview. After the police finally left, Andy went to pick up his sons at school, and then they stayed at his parents' for a few days. Heather's funeral was on Sunday, May 7th, and he and the kids went back to his house that night. On Tuesday, May 9th, he sent his kids back to school and said that before he could get back home from dropping off his daughter that morning, he was headed back to school to pick her up because she had a stomach ache. Well, maybe that's because her mother's funeral had only been 2 days before this. I don't understand why in the world he would think that his daughter would be ready to go back to school just 4 days after her mother had tragically died. Maybe he thought that the sooner everything was back to normal, the sooner people would just move on and wouldn't question Heather's death. But here we are, over 8 years later. Andy then wrote that that same day the police showed up to search his house. Well, according to police records, they didn't perform a search of the house until May 17th. So again, Andy isn't accurate with the retelling of events. He wrote that the police went through the entire house, gathering computers, game consoles, tablets, and cell phones. Andy then said that Captain Mike Hill with the Paulding County Sheriff's Office told Andy he needed to take his daughter's phone. Andy just couldn't believe that they would dare do that, but they did. And Andy made sure that everyone knew how much he disliked Mike Hill. He tells of an exchange that allegedly happened between the two, one where Andy told Mike that, quote, "This is bullshit and the way you're talking is not appreciated," end quote. To which Mike allegedly answered, "I couldn't care less, Mr. Turner. We're here to get rid of people like you." Now, I'm not convinced this actually happened, and it would have been a much better story if Mike had challenged Dipwad to a round of fisticuffs. I had wondered if Mike and Andy were related, though, because Andy's mother's family are Hills. I thought maybe Andy's over-the-top hatred of Mike was just a protesting too much thing. But I guess Hill is a common name, and Andy probably just hates him because he's someone that dares question the great Andrew Donovan Turner. Andy then said that the investigator with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation sat him down and showed him stacks of emails that they'd printed from Heather's email account. According to Andy, the agent told Andy that Heather had been having multiple affairs. Quote, "She told some of these guys that you were a bad husband, that you guys fought, and that she was hit and held against her will." End quote. Well, to me, that sounds like a very particular email that Heather sent to Rob. And in that email, she told Rob that Andy was angry and had locked the bedroom door, then thrown her down on the bed and sat on her so she couldn't leave. Their daughter picked the lock, and Andy took off his belt and acted as if he was going to hit their daughter with it. About 15 minutes after the police left that day, Andy got a call. He said an unknown person said, "You murderer, it will be your turn soon." So Heather and Andy must have had a house phone since the police had just taken all of their electronics, right? Andy wrote that after Heather's death, he could no longer watch movies with gunshots in them. He said that he'd always been a hunter, but was no longer interested. Well, I guess he got over it in a hurry because, according to the sign in log at the gun range he went to, he was there not too long after Heather's death. And he was also there a few days before. And his most current wife has a photo of her and Andy in hunting gear crouched over a dead bear. At least I think it's a bear. I don't know. If it is, it's the mangiest looking bear I've ever seen. And Andy had posted before about the gun range. He posted this image the day before Heather's death, but it wasn't an anniversary post. The original post was made on January 11th, 2015. So Andy purposely decided to pull this image and post it right before her death. It wasn't long before the Paulding County Sheriff's Office was pounding on Andy's door again. This time they had papers for an emergency custody hearing. So Andy and Mindy were once again in court. Andy said that Mindy's attorney started the hearing with, quote, "We are not saying that Mr. Turner is a murderer, but what we are saying is that in his home was violence. Violence that resulted in the death of his wife. We don't know if he did it or she did it or if it was an accident, but we want to ensure that the children are safe until this is figured out." End quote. Well, maybe Andy didn't really mean to put it in quotation marks like it was an actual quote. But it wasn't Andy's fault he was in court again. No sirree, Bob. It was those darn websites and social media people. He said that this campaign was spearheaded by the same team who caused him to lose visitation rights because of parental alienation. Well, go Team Mindy. Andy was ordered to pay more money to Mindy because that's what always happened when they went to court. And this time, the judge required him to take the money to the sheriff's office instead of giving it directly to Mindy. Andy said the reason they wanted him to pay it to the sheriff's office was so they could try and trick him into sitting down for an interview while he was there. Well, none of that is true, at least not the way Andy tells it. There wasn't an emergency custody hearing until 2018. In fact, at the end of March 2017, Andy had filed a half-full custody of son number one. And by this time, son number one was old enough to have a say in which parent he lived with. So Andy got custody of him. What had actually happened with the emergency custody hearing is that Andy hired a nanny to help him with the kids. Well, that's what he called her. She was a nanny with benefits. They started a relationship just 2 weeks after Heather's death, and by October of that year, she was living with Andy. Her name is Christy, and in 2018, she had filed for an order of protection against Andy for domestic violence charges, and she was granted that order. And that is when Mindy filed the emergency custody hearing, after Christy filed for her order of protection, after Christy said Andy had physically abused her. That was the violence in the house. And Mindy was awarded custody of son number one in that hearing. And the payment that was to be taken to the sheriff's office was from yet a different filing. Andy was in contempt for non-payment of child support again, and he had been ordered to pay Mindy $12,000 for attorney's fees, and he'd never made a single payment. That's why he was ordered to take it directly to the sheriff's office. He had a deadline, and if he didn't make the deadline, he was going to be put in jail. Somewhere in the book, Andy claimed that he had spent $1.3 million on attorneys. I seriously doubt he spent that much, but no matter how much he spent, if he would have just paid his child support and not had to be taken to court, he probably would have come out ahead. Andy was arrested in October of 2018 for violating that protection order, but from what I can tell, nothing came of it. I guess they patted him on his head and told him, "Bad Andy, don't do that again." Andy ends chapter 15 admitting that he had started drinking heavily and that, quote, "tiny moments of liquid escape became better than constantly living in the hell Heather created." End quote. Well, what a crap thing to say. Can you imagine trying to convince people that your spouse committed suicide and then having the brazen bojangles to blame that spouse for whatever fallout you were living through because of it? Here's the deal, Dingleberry. If the events around Heather's death weren't so sketchy, you wouldn't have people coming at you. If you hadn't changed multiple aspects of your story, you wouldn't have people coming at you. And to blame your deceased wife is just beyond repulsive. Andy starts chapter 16 with how much he and his children were being harassed. And I have no idea how much of that's true. I mean, considering the source, probably not much. But according to Andy, they couldn't go anywhere without people harassing them. So let me just say that harassing children is never acceptable, even if their father is Andy Turner. Andy then told a story about someone who he thought was a friend of his had made a social media post about Andy, and according to Andy, it was all about what a disgusting piece of doo-doo he was. Now, I have a hard time believing that because most social media sites limit how many characters you can use in a single post. The friend he's talking about is Jeremy Miller, who played Ben on Growing Pains back in the 80s. I don't know how Andy knew Jeremy, but his wife, Joni, started a remembrance page for Heather after her death because Heather was one of her closest friends. On the day of Heather's funeral, Andy claimed that Jeremy called him asking for money because Jeremy was having trouble putting food on the table. I don't believe that. He then went on to say that Heather and Joni weren't ever really good friends. Well, that's not true. Andy is just doing what he did to other people throughout his book. If there's someone who ever took whatever side was opposite of his, he had to talk trash about them in the book. He brought up stories that had no need to be in the book just so he could disparage the person. Andy continued stories of harassment throughout the chapter. He allegedly knocked out some guy in the pharmacy and hit him so hard 2 entire shelves fell over. Son number 1 almost beat up someone in Longhorn Steakhouse, and that same son almost beat up a neighbor. I mean, for someone who's trying to convince people that he could never hurt his wife, he really likes talking about the violence that he and his son inflict or want to inflict on people. One day, Andy received a call from someone in California who wanted to question him. The caller said he was going to make a movie about Heather's life. So Andy said, "The heck you will," and went directly to the Screen Actors Guild and certified the rights to the story of their lives. Well, genius, the Screen Actors Guild doesn't certify movie rights. You certified rights on diddly squat. To make this bit even funnier, in an interview in 2024 on The Jeff Crilly Show, Andy claimed that he'd been in the film industry for 25 years. He had even started a company named Rubicon City Studios in spring of 2024, but it seems that the business went under before it got started. And I'll cover more about it in a video I'm going to make about Andy's companies. And man, are there a lot. Andy started chapter 17 by talking about Jethro Bodine from the Beverly Hillbillies. Quote, "If you have ever watched the Beverly Hillbillies, you know Jethro. He had a goal of growing up and being a double-knot spy, but he was just the show's idiot with the brawn." End quote. The best part about that entire sentence is that Andy misspelled not. Andy used Jethro as a pejorative throughout the book against journalists, content creators, social media users, documentarians. Basically, anyone who wasn't pro-Andy was called a Jethro. He said they were all wannabe detectives, but were really just idiots. That's rich. One morning, a drove, or as Andy says, a grove of Jethros, aka reporters, showed up on his lawn wanting to get some statements from him. They began asking questions about Heather and how many men she was seeing and if he'd heard about the email she'd sent, and was it true that she was seeing some of the deputies. And even though Andy allegedly shooed them away without answering those questions, they did make him wonder. So off he went to Heather's closet and took down one of her purses. He said he discovered notes from various men, so he kept searching. And by the time he'd finished, he'd found stacks of cards that came with flower deliveries, 3 burner phones, and 3 pregnancy tests that were all positive. Well, Andy needs to work for the Georgia Bureau of Investigations because they'd already been out to search the house and somehow missed all of that. I'm pretty sure they would have taken those 3 burner phones. Also, pregnancy tests are only viable for about 10 minutes after they show the initial result. It's not uncommon for them to appear to be a positive after that initial 10 minutes. Andy said that he's received death threats and that they had over 40 nails in their tires, but sometimes it's that many slashed tires and other times it's 46. Andy is always the victim. People are always out to get him, and it's never because he's done anything wrong. He said Jethros were everywhere. He said his children couldn't go out in public because they were constantly being confronted by Jethros. Social media Jethros slandered Andy and even started rumors that he was sleeping with everyone he saw. Andy talked trash about the episode of It Couldn't Happen Here, where people spoke about Heather's death and told the truth. He really didn't like the funeral home worker, and Andy even said that's because this particular worker said that Heather was a beautiful woman, inside and out. Andy wrote, quote, "Do I think he was inappropriate when her body arrived back? I sure wish I had a camera access to verify," end quote. So, Mr. Whiny Pants has been complaining about everybody slandering him, but he's perfectly okay with insinuating that the funeral worker might have been inappropriate with Heather's body. This dude is too much. I think what might have made Andy really not like this guy is that on that episode, he said that the location of the gunshot wound and the lack of a contact wound would have made it impossible for Heather to have shot herself, meaning that the gun would have had to have been held away from her head, and it would have been impossible for her to have held the gun that way. But along this same line on that show, Andy was confronted and told that Christy had said Andy had told her one time that she should hold Heather's ashes so he could have sex with both of them at once. And when Andy was confronted, he didn't say, "What are you talking about? There's no way I would ever say anything like that." All he said was, "She told you that?" This guy needs help. Andy tried to clarify the whole gunshot thing by saying that Heather shot herself from the left side and used a soft tip hollow point, and that those bullets spread, and that's why a bullet was never found, that it had turned to shrapnel inside her head. He claimed he threw away every box of those bullets after her death because he just couldn't stand to look at them. For those of you who've watched my channel for any length of time, you know I readily admit that I have little knowledge about guns. In fact, you could say what I know about guns could fit inside a shot glass. So I tried to figure out what kind of bullet Andy was talking about, and I couldn't find a soft tip hollow point. I did find a hollow soft point, so maybe that's what he meant, but even if the bullet fragmented, those fragments would still have been found. Also, Andy's explanation doesn't cover why there wasn't a contact wound. In Chapter 18, Andy starts talking about how a few months after Heather's death, he started sleeping with multiple women, sometimes 3 or 4 women a day. Well, hang on. Just a few pages back, that was only supposed to be a rumor started by those social media Jethros. And also, ew. Andy said it was a way to ease his pain. And as his sleeping with women increased, so did his drinking. He claimed his children made him stop drinking, but there's no mention whether he broke his habit of sleeping with multiple women or not. Andy and son number 1 then both gave a long account of how they'd traveled to New York, and while there, Andy had to have emergency surgery for an esophageal tear. The story was that Andy was throwing up blood all over the airport, and I'm not sure if I believe everything about this story, especially the part where Andy said, quote, "The day I woke up, they removed the vent. I had visits from nurses and doctors that day. The ER doctor came to see me and, holding back tears, told me she had been so worried," end quote. Oh, please. I also thought it was interesting that in 2008, in a letter Heather wrote to Andy, she was telling him that he had lied about where he was one day and she had proof. Quote, "On October 4th, you took 15 pictures at Kegel's Dairy between 12:38 and 2:19 p.m. You let me sit and worry myself sick, thinking you were in the hospital puking up blood, while you were out having a great family day. And your pathetic little picture you took at the physician's center to try to make it look real was taken after you'd come home that very same day at 4:14 p.m. End quote. Andy ends the chapter by saying that while he was in the hospital, he was getting nasty messages from Mindy about how he was in contempt and would be back in court. Quote, "Geez, a man can't even die without crossing this bitch." End quote. Wow, Andy, it's almost like if you would have paid the court-ordered child support and other various payments, you wouldn't have been found in contempt. We're already up to chapter 19 and thankfully another chapter closer to the end. It's now the end of 2020, and Andy and his children decided that living in the house that Heather had died in was too much for them, so they purchased a new home. According to Andy, their new house wasn't in a gated community and didn't have a guardhouse like their previous places, but at least the golf course it was on was decent. He claimed that, quote, "We purchased a new home in the Georgian Golf and Country Club," end quote. Well, no, they didn't, because that isn't a thing. There's no place named that. And I have trouble believing that Andy ever lived in a gated community. One of his houses did have an entrance you drove through with security cameras, but it didn't look anything like a gated community. And I think the real reason he bought a house was because the owner of the house that he and Heather rented from sold it just a few days after Andy purchased the house he and his wife still live in. Andy talked about how their new neighbors in the neighborhood harassed them. The HOA told him they'd gotten 150 calls in a week. At the writing of this book, he still owed the HOA $10,000 in violation fees. Is any of that true? Who knows? He then jumped off the timeline again and took us back to 2018. Good grief, man, is it really that hard to write a timeline and stick to it? Anyway, he wrote about how he met his current wife, Kelly, at a grief counseling class. Her husband died a year after Heather's, which means they met pretty soon after her husband's death. Now, did they actually meet at a grief counseling class? I don't know, and at this point, I could give half a toot. I've looked at Kelly's social media, and frankly, she seems just as shallow and vapid as Andy. She wrote a few pages in the book, and she talked about her childhood, and then wrote about being harassed once she started dating Andy, and that DFCS started showing up because they were getting calls about her son. And after she and Andy met, she went to a 30-day treatment for alcoholism, and while she was gone, she had left her son in Andy's care. Once her former in-laws, her own father, and her brother-in-law found out that she had left him with Andy, they filed for emergency custody. Her son was taken from Andy and sent to family members while she finished rehab. They went to court 3 weeks later, and Kelly said she just couldn't figure out why they kept talking about Andy during court. Really, chick? You were going to leave your son with him for an entire month and hadn't bothered to tell any of your son's actual relatives. And this is the same guy who lost custody of his own children, who alienated their mother, who lost custody again because his girlfriend had to get an order of protection because of domestic violence. And oh yeah, the guy whose wife's death still isn't classified as a suicide or a homicide. Why would you want your child around this guy to begin with? And I guess that's no longer even a question that needs to be asked. From what I can tell, Kelly no longer has custody of her son. There are 0 photos of her son on any of her social media pages. None. You would never know she had a son by looking at her photos. In fact, in a photo from last year's Christmas, everyone in the family has a stocking hanging up except for him. How utterly heartbreaking for that child. While I'm sure she would swear that she didn't give up her son for Andy Turner, I think she did. In that same year, Heather's Aunt Cindy took Andy to court for emergency custody of his daughter. The court didn't find in her favor, but what Andy did to his daughter during this is despicable. He claimed in his book that the court was demanding that he had to take his daughter for a DNA test to prove he was her biological father. Quote, "I looked back to see many of Mindy's cronies in attendance. They paraded some photos through the court, making allegations that my daughter could have been fathered by any one of the guys in the photographs. The court took a recess and ordered me to take my daughter for a DNA test and return at 9 a.m. the next day." End quote. Let me say here, I don't believe that Heather was having multiple affairs. Anyway, this is what Dipwad wrote about the DNA test. Quote, "I picked up my daughter as an awful thunderstorm rolled in. As I drove, the wipers could not keep up with the rain coming down. This was how my heart felt. My car being flooded with harm. As I looked over to my daughter, I saw she was crying about as hard as it was raining. "What's wrong, baby girl?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Dad, what if tomorrow I have to go and live somewhere else?" We both cried as we drove. End quote. Well, that would definitely be a traumatic thing for a child to have to endure. Wondering if the only man she's ever known as her father was actually her father, and wondering if she was going to be taken away from him. So, first off, why would Andy even let her know that's what was happening? Why not just tell her she had to have her blood drawn for some other reason? Something way less traumatic. Now, I decided to look at the court records to see if I could figure out what was actually happening. And I couldn't find anywhere where Cindy had demanded a DNA test to prove that Andy was the biological father. In fact, her initial filing states that he is the legal father of his daughter. What I did find was a request by Andy that Cindy have a DNA test done to prove she was biologically his daughter's aunt, though. And I think if Andy went in for a DNA test to prove he was his daughter's father, it was his choice to do so. But never mind facts. Andy claimed he and his daughter went to the office and that they were both crying when they approached the counter. He told the woman at the counter that they were there for a court-ordered DNA test, and they had to have the results back to the court the next day. Then this woman, whoever or whatever she was, swabbed them both and they walked out. Then Andy claimed that the same lady behind the desk called him the very next day and, quote, "I'm not supposed to be calling you, but you and your daughter touched my heart so much," said the lady from the DNA office. "I have the couriers on the way up right now to take the paper to the judge, but I wanted to let you know that you are your daughter's father," end quote. Andy also wrote that the court ordered Cindy to not use any form of media to spread lies or speak badly of him or his family. Actually, the court ordered that, quote, "neither party is to use social media to make disparaging comments about the other party," end quote. What he left out about the court case was something that was included in the final order. This court does continue to have concerns based upon past acts of family violence in the home of the defendant. In Chapter 21, Andy shared texts between him and Heather, and they're supposed to prove that she wasn't leaving him, but they don't. He also said that the FBI, the GBI, and the Secret Service all have access to those texts. So now the FBI and the Secret Service are investigating him? Does that mean he's being investigated for financial crimes? Because I can't imagine why else the Secret Service would be involved. Andy finally ends his book by admitting that he's refused a Grant Paulding County Sheriff's Office request for him to be formally interviewed. He wrote that he knows that they would twist and manipulate his words, and that he basically doesn't care if Heather's case is ever closed. Imagine not caring if her family ever gets closure. Imagine not allowing your own daughter to get closure in her mother's death. Imagine being that big of a self-centered, pathetic lump of ick. After writing this book filled with lies and vitriol towards people he felt had wronged him, Andy wrote that he just wants to spread love and that when people lie, he doesn't feel like he owes them a response. This man has the self-awareness of a slug. Andy said that he and his family decided to go back to his hometown, and they bought a large tract of land there. Well, large is subjective because it's only 26 acres. And according to court records, he still owns property in Paulding County. So while they do own property in Cedartown, they're still living in the house that's not part of any country club. Andy claimed that they bought the farm with the plan to build and give the kids a safe haven. All that's been built so far is a 10,000 square foot garage, so he and his oldest son can house their multiple collectible cars there. Whew, that was a lot to go through. And if you've made it this far, you deserve some kind of medal. So why did I drag us through all of this mess? Partly to show that while Andy claims to only have his family's best interest in mind, he doesn't mind sharing a book with the world that disparages their family, their loved ones, and especially their mothers. I don't think Heather was sleeping with anyone other than Andy. But if she had been, why would you want her daughter to know that? Why could she just not have had good memories about her mother? Was telling her her mother died by suicide not enough for her to bear? And then you dragged her along on all of your book tour interviews, so she could relive that trauma. As a father, why would you want your daughter to have any negative thoughts about her mother when there's absolutely no need for them? His sons wrote that their mother, Mindy, only cared about money, and that's why she took Andy to court. So where do you think they heard that from? It wasn't from Andy showing them court documents that show that Mindy took him to court because he kept refusing to pay what he was ordered to pay. Andy spoke poorly about his wives because he felt it benefited him to do so. I think it made him look like a simple, cruel, conniving, self-centered liar. I also dragged us through all of this to show just how much Andy does lie. I could have just said, hey, this guy is a great big liar, liar, pants on fire, but I think it has more impact to show it piece by piece. When someone lies about just about everything, it shows that they'll lie about anything. There was something that Andy wrote that, of course, wasn't about himself, but it's something that I wholeheartedly agree with, and that was that only a fool will base their facts on the word of a liar. Before I go, I want to talk a little about the interview that Andy had on the Paulding County News podcast. The interviewer asked Andy what the public had misconstrued about Heather's death. And here are his answers in the order he gave them. 1. Heather was leaving him. He said they never had any problems and had a very happy home. 2. The wall in the bathroom had been washed, and that was mentioned in the coroner's report. He said he wasn't going to talk badly about the coroner, but she had made mistakes. He said she was new to the job and this was only her first or second coroner case. 3. That he was never questioned. Andy said that this was the biggest lie that was out there about Heather's death, and it bothered him more than any other. But you know what Andy didn't say had been misconstrued about Heather's death? That he had murdered her. That wasn't on his list. People thinking that Heather was leaving him, that the bathroom wall had been washed, and that he wasn't questioned were more devastating to Andy than people thinking he had killed her. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe as this helps my channel grow and get stories like Heather's to more people. Paid memberships are a way to directly support my work and help me keep bringing these stories to light. Thank you so much for making it possible. I'll have a link for you to join in the description box. I'm going to take a short break from Heather's case, just long enough to get an episode of 12 Unsolved posted and to get Andy Turner out of my head for a bit. But I'll be back soon. Until then, stay safe and be happy.